Welcome. In this video, we will talk about the hydrometeorological hazard risk reduction. So basically, a conference was held, a video webinar kind of a thing was held, in which the NIDM, which is your National Institute for Disaster Management, had talked about how to come across and work on the basis of hydrometeorological hazard risk reduction. So this risk reduction is a very important factor for disaster management. So let's start our video and see what exactly it has talked about. So as mentioned, the National Institute for Disaster Management NIDM has actually come up with a webinar which talks about how the disaster in terms of your hydrometeorological hazard could be taken care of. Now this webinar series launched 4 webinars which specifically focused on the things like thunderstorms, lightning, cloudburst, floods, cyclone, storm surges and climate change as well as extreme weather events. Now see, if you look at the themes and the focuses which are there, they are all hydrometeorological events, and because of the recent climate changes as well as other because of the increase in the frequency of your extreme weather event, it was very important that we adopt the basis of risk reduction. So risk reduction has become a very important factor moving forward in terms of your disaster management. So the topics which were taken care was thunderstorms and lightning. So if you have been following news, there was a case of death by thunderstorm in Bihar. So because of it, again this webinar talks about how we can deal with such kind of things, because thunderstorm and lightning is not considered as disaster by the common people. They would have not been the scenario, but this year itself the lightning has struck and people have died because of that, and again because of it, it required that the focus should be placed on how we can go for the risk reduction in terms of thunderstorms and lightning damages as well. Then cloud burst and floods have been very frequent in India, starting from the Kedarnath cloud burst to the urban floods which Kerala has witnessed like twice in a consecutive year. So such kind of things are again very important for the matter of risk reduction. Storm surges is again a very important point, because we have the cyclones at the west coast as well as the east coast. So it's again very important factor that how we can go for the risk reduction, because risk reduction is very important for managing disaster. It is more of a preemptive way by which we can reduce the damages which could be caused by the disaster. So hence it is very important that we realize these topics, and hence the webinar was focused on these topics. Now this particular web series is focused on enhancing human capacity in terms of better understanding of hydrometeorological hazard risk and effective collaborative actions. Now if you look at it, this particular thing saying is that we have to go towards a factor where we can build more human capacity in terms of how the hydrometeorological disaster could be handled. Collaborative efforts are required from the multiple organs within the executive as well as the government, so that we can come up with a better strategy to deal with the disaster. Now this particular webinar focuses on the Prime Minister 10-point agenda. So Prime Minister in his 10-point agenda has talked about what should be the future strategy for our disaster management. And presently, if you know, we are following the Sendai framework. Before that, it was the Yokohama strategy which was followed, and it was been a part of it, and in between come the Hyogo framework. So these are all major frameworks which are related to the disaster management at the UN level. So at presently from 2015 onwards, we are following the Sendai framework. Earlier it was Hyogo framework, and before it was Yokohama strategy. So these are the major UN strategy which was formed in terms of disaster management. And India has actually taken a pioneer in the Asia Pacific region with terms of how the Sendai framework should be framed. So back in the 2017-18, we had a conference where Pradhan Mantri of India has provided the 10 points agenda, that how we should go for the risk reduction, we should manage the mitigation efforts, as well as we should have proper early warning system so that the risk could be reduced drastically. So these are the few topics this particular webinar talks about. Now let's move forward and try to see what basically National Institute of Disaster Management is. So this particular institute is a major institute which provide training and capacity development program for managing natural disasters in India. So the training, the capacity building, the people who will go to a place when there is a disaster, such kind of training is provided by your NIDM. And this particular NIDM is actually considered as a center of excellence. So this has been formed as a center of excellence. So this is one of the points that you should know. And now one another thing that you need to know is that this is formed by a act of government. So Disaster Management Act of 2005 is the one which passed the bill which actually lead to the formation of NIDM. So NIDM is actually a statutory body. A statutory body means it has been established by the law. So this act of Disaster Management 2005 established NIDM. Earlier it was known as the National Center for your Disease Management, NCDM, constituted under the Act of Parliament in 1995. So again, when it was known as the National Center of Disaster Management, that time also it was the statutory body because it was formed by the Act of Parliament in 1995. But now what we have today is your National Institute of Disaster Management, which is based on the Disaster Management Act of 2005. Now let's also see what is the major role of NIDM. So NIDM is responsible for planning and promoting training and research in the area of disaster management, documentation and development of national level information base relating to disaster management policy, prevention mechanism and mitigation measure. So if you see, NIDM has a very overarching kind of a role where it is responsible for training personnel, as well as it is also responsible for forming policy, for advising on policy, what kind of policy should be formed which could help in reducing the disaster risk, as well as mitigation measures, what kind of policy should be adopted for mitigation measure. And it also works in the phase of documentation, because without documentation it becomes very difficult to manage the situation. In fact, from the UPSC point of view also, you should go to the NDMA website and look at the guidelines of the major hazards in India. At times in mains examination they have directly asked about the guidelines, that for an example, for a case of chemical disaster, what are the guidelines suggested by NDMA. So it is very important that now you go back to your go back after the class and check the NDMA website and pick out the guidelines which they have provided for various hazards and disaster. So this is the major thing which NIDM will take care of in terms of its training the personnel, as well as providing the policy guidelines, as well as working for the documentation. So this is there. But if you remember, the apex body of disaster management in India is actually NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority. This is the apex body which takes care of disasters in India. Now when we are at the topic, now let's also see what exactly are hydrometeorological hazards. So we have briefly discussed about the topic which this webinar talks about, and those were all related to the hydrometeorological hazard. But let's also see, we have typhoon. Typhoon is like what we have cyclones over here, thunderstorm, flash flood, coastal storm surges, La Nina and El Nino. So La Nina and El Nino are also considered as disaster because they could create a situation which could lead to either extreme rainfall or the condition of drought, which are also considered as a condition for disaster. Drought and flood both are classified as disaster, and El Nino and La Nina both had effect to cause either the increase in the rainfall or in the decrease in the rainfall, and hence these are also considered as hydrometeorological hazards. So I hope you have understood this video, you have understood what hydrometeorological hazards are, what is an NIDM. Go back and check for the NDMA organization as well. Check for the Disaster Management Act of 2005. And in this video, and apart from that, for any disaster management related issue, if you have any doubt, please comment on the video. Thank you.